Of all the hella-born forces that operated throughout the Vietnam War, none struck more fear into the hearts of enemy troops than the air cavalry. These multi-purpose reconnaissance units performed some of the most daring missions of the entire conflict, tracking down elusive enemy troops and forcing them to fight in a war that had no boundaries and no clear order of battle. This is the story of how just one of those units, the Air Cavalry Squadron of the 1st Cavalry Division, performed their incredible missions. It's the story of bold scout pilots who flew just above the treetops, scouring jungle terrain for the depression of enemy footprints, for the smell of enemy campfires, or for the flash of enemy gunfire. It's the story of how the scouts operated in lethal hunter-killer teams with helicopter gunships, how the crews of those gunships fought to keep the scouts alive during their relentless pursuit of the enemy, and how they attacked and pinned the enemy down with withering barrages of fire from one of the most potent weapon systems of all time. And it's the story of rifle platoons, of flight crews who hovered into thousands of hostile landing zones, braving enemy fire and unforgiving terrain, and of the small infantry units that they inserted to flush out and engage the enemy in battle. It's the story of a unique group of men who fought hard to defend South Vietnam against communist aggression, and who in the process helped to validate the effectiveness of the very first air mobile ground division in the world. It is the story of the Air Cavalry in Vietnam. In 1968, the strength of the Air Cavalry's hunter-killer teams was dramatically increased with the arrival of the Bell AH-1 Huey Cobra. The Cobra, which rapidly replaced the cavalry's modified Huey gunships, was the world's first helicopter designed specifically for armed combat. These powerful, highly maneuverable attack birds could carry up to 52 rockets in side-mounted pods and were equipped with a rotating chin turret that housed a combination of grenade launchers and miniguns. A two-man team operated the gunship in a unique arrangement that placed the gunner in the nose of the aircraft and a pilot slightly above and behind him to increase combat visibility. The hunter-killers were further strengthened by the arrival of the Hughes OH-6 Cayuse, a light observation helicopter more commonly known as the Loach. This small, fast, and nimble aircraft replaced the outdated and vulnerable Sioux Scout as the cavalry's primary reconnaissance vehicle. The Loach was armed with a minigun, which the pilot fired from the left side of the aircraft, and a .60 caliber machine gun, which was fired by a door gunner in the rear. Next to the Huey, the Loach became the most widely used helicopter of the Vietnam War and proved to be an invaluable addition to the Air Cavalry's fleet. Despite the introduction of new and improved aircraft, the strategies and organization of the squadron essentially remained unchanged from the experimental days of the 11th Air Assault Division. In fact, scout pilots used the fast and agile Loach to probe even closer to suspected North Vietnamese and Viet Cong positions. As a general rule, if a new scout lasted for a couple of months, he would be able to survive even the most hair-raising encounters. Still, the chances remained high that he would eventually be brought down.
Some of the terms we had back then was, and these guys, did some tremendous things, but we went fishing with people.
To prevent the loss of a Loach, the squadron developed sophisticated and extremely precise tactics for employing the Cobra's potent new weapon systems. Flying roughly 1,000 feet above, but slightly behind the Loach, the Cobra's flight team watched and waited, poised to strike at the first sign of trouble.
If the scout pilot decided it was time to pull power and get out of there very quickly, the front seater, or the X-rays we called them, well, if the Loach took fire, he could have minigun rounds down around the Loach, behind him preferably, not in front of him, within about 15 seconds, 10 to 15 seconds. And we practiced that. I was the aircraft commander. Then while you're doing that, you're moving the aircraft in to get a line so you can shoot rockets. because it may be he stumbled upon the lead of, say, a company-sized force, 100 or 200 people, maybe a regiment. You don't really know. So you want to be able to put rockets down around him in case he's flying the wrong direction, around him, behind him, or in front of him maybe. And in less than 30 seconds, you want rockets impacting around the Loach to help suppress the fire so he can get out of there.
Despite the intense and even heroic attempts of gunship crews to prevent Scout losses, there was often nothing that could be done. Scout crews suffered some of the highest casualty rates of any U.S. serviceman. Over 650 Loaches alone were shot down, more than 22% of all U.S. helicopters lost in combat. Losing a Scout crew was perhaps the worst fear of a gunship pilot flying in the Air Cavalry Squadron. The crews of the hunter-killer teams often forged intense bonds as they confronted danger and even death on a daily basis. On August 9, 1969, a pink team was sent to investigate a large enemy store of rice for a potential airstrike. As was often the case, however, they uncovered something far greater in the process. Captain Joe Bowen was commanding the pink team's Cobra gunship as it flew cover for the Scout below.
We got up there at about 8:50 in the morning, and he's checking out the rice, and it's a lot of rice, and yes, it's good for an airstrike. We're waiting for the fighters to get on station, and the fighters are a little late. So we started going back west. He said he thought he saw some activity, recent activity, about 2 kilometers to the west of where the rice was. So we headed back west. I was again at about 1,000 feet behind him and above him, and he was going about 100 miles an hour to get to this other area he saw recent activity. And all of a sudden, all around him, both sides of him, it was just flashes, muzzle flashes. And I'm right behind him, just couldn't believe that it happened. Called a mayday, down bird. I'm going down. The front seat, Gene Olson, who was killed a little later on in January. He's put minigun fire down around him, but we can see where he's at because he's a ball of fire where he went in. I'm putting rockets down and flechettes down around the enemy, and it wasn't normal for us. We didn't see maybe 15, 20 people at one time. If we saw that many people in the open, it was a big event. We may have seen 15 or 20 people 3 or 4 times during the day, but we never saw a big company-sized unit. And this was the biggest I'd ever seen. These were hundreds of people, and they came out of the tree line shooting. They'd been exposed, and they started shooting. And I made it down, don't know how, and came on down around them. And our job was to, find the enemy and fix them. But our job to ourselves was to take care of each other. The force is inbound, their enemy around. They're shooting, and I'm hovering around, and they're scared. They look like brand new uniforms, fresh troops. So, like that battle calculus you're thinking about. Fresh troops, scared, just been, conscripted or whatever. They're shooting, but they're shooting, aiming to the left, and you're in front of them, so they're not good shots. So they're probably more scared than we are. And Gene and I, we're just, we're terrified ourselves. And I thought I was taking a couple of hits, and Gene was talking about it. It was my knees bouncing inside the crew compartment. I was so afraid, my knees were banging back and forth. We got to hover down around him, and weren't sure if the door gun had been thrown out before it impacted or not. So because we had a down bird and potentially one of our soldiers, one of our cav troopers on the ground alive, the full force of the rescue and take care of your own was in process.
There was an unspoken bond in the cavalry squadron that if you went down, no matter what happened, someone would always come for you. Within minutes of Captain Bowen's call, slicks from the squadron's rifle platoon had lifted off and were en route to the downed Scout. At the same time, gunships from the weapons platoon were racing in to provide fire support, and up to an additional battalion of the division's infantry were being airlifted into the area. Despite the potential danger on the ground, the rifle platoon was inserted to secure a landing zone near the crash site. Initially, the rifle platoon and 2 platoons of infantry from a quick reaction force encountered light resistance in and around the LZ. As they were attempting to secure the area, another infantry company was inserted to support those already on the ground. Almost immediately, a heavy firefight broke out and the entire force was pinned down. As the fight intensified, the men were forced to set up defensive positions around the LZ. Throughout the morning, additional reinforcements arrived in an attempt to expand the defensive perimeter until a full infantry battalion had become engaged in the battle. It soon became apparent that the enemy force was much larger than anyone had expected. Realizing that his troops were overcommitted and that they were being overwhelmed, the battalion commander requested that the entire force be extracted from the area. Ultimately, the troops had to wait until last light before they could... Because of the battle, American commanders were alerted to the fact that at least an entire NVA regiment had crossed, that an enemy force of that size was operating anywhere near the area, let alone that one was mounting a large-scale offensive. While the battle itself was not characteristic of most cavalry operations, many critical elements of the incident were. The scout crew's courageous and skillful attempts to locate the enemy prompted the entire engagement. The willingness of squadron troopers to risk. In the end, the squadron's initial contact provided Allied forces with enough warning to prepare for the enemy's offensive, possibly preventing a major disaster and saving dozens, if not hundreds, of lives. Throughout most of the Vietnam War, Allied forces were prohibited from striking enemy sanctuaries located in Laos and Cambodia. The restrictions were especially frustrating for the troops of the 1st Cavalry Division, who routinely engaged North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops during offensives launched from these areas. On May 1st, 1970, the frustration ended, at least temporarily, as the division launched a massive incursion into Cambodia in conjunction with the South Vietnamese Army. Throughout the 2-month campaign, the division's air cavalry squadron proved once again to be a critical component of successful air mobile operations. From escorting a massive flight of slicks into a secured landing zone to performing intensive aerial and ground reconnaissance, the squadron became the workhorse of the entire campaign. The assault was designed to take the fight to the enemy by defeating the communists in their own backyard. The targets were the hidden base camps and supply stores that had plagued U.S. and Allied forces since the early 1960s. Key to the entire operation was the speed, flexibility, and element of surprise inherent in an air mobile fighting force overall, and in the air cavalry's tactics in particular. The assault was a dramatic success. Perhaps the greatest discovery of the campaign was an area that came to be known as the City. Air cavalry reconnaissance had uncovered a well-developed enemy planning, training, and storage area that spanned more than 3 square kilometers. Further probing uncovered more than 180 storage bunkers, 18 mess halls, classrooms, a firing range, and even a small animal farm. While NVA forces had evacuated the site, captured supply records and other intelligence indicated that the area had served as a well-organized storage depot and training facility for replacement troops being sent from North Vietnam. Supplies captured from this cache site alone included more than 1,500 infantry and anti-aircraft guns, 2 million rounds of ammunition, 58,000 pounds of plastic explosives, 22 cases of anti-personnel mines, thousands of grenades and mortars, and nearly 30 tons of rice. The move into Cambodia exceeded all expectations and proved to be one of the most successful operations in the history of the 1st Cavalry Division. While controversial, many argued that such an offensive should have been mounted much sooner. If Allied forces had been able to prevent the communists from amassing troops and supplies just outside of South Vietnam, it is possible that the outcome of the war would have been very different. Throughout the Cambodian campaign and the entire Vietnam War, the 1st Cavalry Division repeatedly demonstrated the potency of air mobility. redefining the capabilities of conventional ground forces forever. However, the division's extraordinary success may never have been possible without the scouts, the gunships, and the rifle platoons of the division's Air Cavalry Squadron. It was their courageous attempts to seek out and engage the enemy that enabled the notion of an air mobile division to be taken from concept to reality in the jungles and marshlands of South Vietnam.